Good morning. Hello, I'm Helen Christians, and I will be your MC this morning. Welcome to the Humanists of Greater Portland Sunday morning meeting. I want to welcome those folks who are joining us through Zoom and those attending in person at Friendly House. The Humanists of Greater Portland is a chapter of the American Humanists Association. Humanism is an outlook or system of belief or thought attaching primary importance to human experiences and the wonders of the natural world, rather than supernatural beliefs. Humanist values can be really easy when it's just me doing my thing and everyone stays out of my way. We're all pretty good humanists until another human enters the room. When all those other humans enter the mix, that's when humanism is tested. But it's also when our humanism's full power is unleashed. I just thought that was just so true, so really true. It's my belief that the HTP volunteers who consistently make these weekly meetings happen are certainly an example of the power of humanism. Our topic at today's meeting, it's about so much more than shelter, especially addresses the humanist commitments of ethical development, social justice, and empathy. Kathy Humble will be our reader this morning. Kathy, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Oh, wonderful. Come on in.
Okay. Good morning. Today I'm going to read from Think Again by Adam Grant, who teaches psychology at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School. I'm going to read the last few paragraphs of the book. Then the coronavirus pandemic happened, and I became curious about how leaders communicate during crisis. How do they give people a sense of security in the present and hope for the future? Preaching the virtues of their plans and prosecuting alternative proposals could reduce uncertainty. Making a political case might rally the base around shared goals. For me, the most instructive example came from the governor of New York. In an early speech in the spring, as his state and the nation faced an unprecedented crisis, he announced, "It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something." The New York Times quickly eviscerated the governor's speech, noting that something unspecified is no better than nothing. Whereas other leaders were precise, concrete, positive, the governor was indefinite, abstract, irresolute. It wasn't just the media that trashed the speech. One of the governor's own advisors apparently described it as an act of political stupidity. This didn't happen during the coronavirus pandemic, and the governor wasn't Andrew Cuomo. It occurred the last time unemployment in America was so high, during the Great Depression. It was 1932, and the governor of New York was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He delivered his "try something" message as the country was reeling from the Great Depression in a commencement speech at a small university in Georgia. In the most memorable line from the speech, FDR argued that the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. That principle became a touchstone of his leadership. Although economists are still debating which of the resulting reforms lifted the country out of a historic depression, FDR's trial and error method of formulating policy was popular enough that Americans elected him president 4 times. In his commencement speech, FDR wasn't preaching, prosecuting, or appealing to politics. He spoke with the same kind of confident humility that you'd expect from a scientist. I'd love to see more people do their rethinking out loud, as FDR did. As valuable as rethinking is, we don't do it enough, whether we're grappling with the pivotal decisions of our lives or the great quandaries of our time. Complex problems like pandemics, climate change, and political polarization call on us to stay mentally flexible. In the face of any number of unknown and evolving threats, humility, doubt, and curiosity are vital to discovery. Bold, persistent experimentation might be our best tool for rethinking. We can all improve at thinking again. Whatever conclusion we reach, I think the world would be a better place if everyone put on scientist goggles a little more often. I'm curious, do you agree? If not, what evidence would change your mind?
Thank you, Kathy. That was really interesting and so true that we just need to think things through and say if we made a mistake or something might come up better. Thank you so much for sharing that. Truly appreciate it. I would now like to welcome today's speaker, Andy Goebel. Originally, Andy hailed from the great state of Michigan. This podcast junkie and diehard fan of the Detroit Lions fell in love with the Rose City when he and his family moved here over a decade ago. He's all about neighborhood life in their beloved North Portland. Originally trained in secondary education at Western Washington University, Andy was called from teaching high school to seminary at North Park Theological Seminary in 2004, where he received his master's in divinity in 2007. He went on to help found Portsmouth Union Church, a progressive and inclusive congregation that has hosted winter shelters for people experiencing homelessness and is currently building 20 units of affordable housing on their property to house the same population. Talk about putting belief into action. Before moving into his full-time role at All Good Northwest, Andy served as the Director of Emergency Management for Good Multnomah, where he provided program design, leadership, and oversight for sheltering services in congregate, motel, and village modeled settings. Welcome, Andy. This is going to be just a marvelous presentation, so timely and so needed. I'm glad you're willing to share your thoughts with us today.
Well, thanks, everyone. I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm glad we got the little bit of bio there, so you hear a little bit of my story. My plan for our time is to go a little more into how I got into this work of supporting and sheltering and eventually housing individuals experiencing houselessness here in our city. Talk a little bit about the story of All Good Northwest, how we came to be and the work that we do, and then to talk about the future. What does this work look like? And quite frankly, how do we start to wrap our minds and hearts and hands around an actual solution, if you will, to what I think is the foremost issue in our city, that of housing and houselessness. So I got into this work early on in my time here in Portland. As was mentioned in the bio there, my family and I moved to Portland in 2011 to start a new church. And during that time, from the very beginning, we began to experience connection with individuals experiencing houselessness. We were afforded the opportunity to use a little church building up in my beloved North Portland. And as soon as we started to occupy that space and do our work, we began to have a couple who were sleeping in the back stairway leading down to the basement. And they would stay there nightly just to have a safe place to be. And that's become a pretty regular sight, as you all know, around our city. Churches are sanctuary spaces and have typically been safe places for individuals experiencing houselessness. And these two, and their names are Gilbert and Sandy. And Gilbert and Sandy, I would reach out to when I'd show up in the church in the morning. I'd connect with them. Do you have any needs? Did you get something to eat? Do you need to use the bathroom? How can I help you? And then I would go into my office and begin to do my work, but it's really hard to try to focus on ancient scriptures and applying them to the modern world when the reality of individuals who are hungry and hopeless and helpless are right literally outside your doorstep. And so I'd find myself in my times of meditation asking, how do we do something systemically? How do we, as people of faith, as just individuals, faith or no faith, how do we do something systemically to help individuals in this housing crisis? Little did I know that 10 years later, we'd be facing an exacerbated crisis like we're looking at today, where folks like Gilbert and Sandy are on every on-ramp and off-ramp of our freeways, sleeping under all of our bridges, and in some cases camped out right down the street from our house. Well, the answer to that inquiry in my time of meditation started when we as a church made a commitment to have the only emergency severe weather shelter in North Portland at the time. We collected a group of volunteers from throughout the neighborhood who would sign up, and on nights where it dipped below freezing, we would have volunteers come to our church. Folks would sleep on mats in the sanctuary, and they at least had a warm, safe place to be for the night. And we did that for a couple of years. And unfortunately, it grew beyond our capacity to continue that work, because as much as we had really good-hearted folks who would show up and give their time and stay up all night with individuals so that they could have a safe place to sleep, the volunteer base was not enough because the issue became so great, and we have had so many people sleeping in the sanctuary. And so a group of pastors in North Portland and I, who are committed to continuing this work of providing this overnight shelter, put our heads together, put our prayerful hearts together, and said, how do we continue to do this when we don't have the volunteers and we don't have the capacity? And the answer to our prayer came in the form of an organization called Good Multnomah. It's mentioned in my bio. Good Multnomah was started back in 2015 by a man named Chris Aosa. And Chris is the former executive director now, but he's founder of Do Good, a veteran himself who is committed to sheltering, supporting, and housing veterans experiencing houselessness in our city. And I met Chris and we connected immediately, and he asked me to be on the board of that organization. And then eventually, Do Good came alongside our little volunteer shelter and was able to open the church every night throughout the winter and provide staffing and support so that every single night individuals could count on having a safe place to sleep, not just when the weather dipped below freezing. Fast forward a little bit in that work, and I eventually started to manage that shelter as I was still pastoring the church that was hosting the shelter. And then the pandemic hit. When the pandemic hit, early on, I would still, the folks who at this particular shelter, they would come in at night, maybe have a little snack if volunteers had donated, and then go to sleep. And the next morning they had to collect their stuff and move on. Well, I found myself sending folks out of the church into a world that was all shutting down, and they had no place to go because our public spaces were closing down because of the pandemic. And so I went to the Joint Office of Homeless Services. And if you're not familiar with the Joint Office, that is a combination of funding and support from the city and the county that has come together to tackle the issue of homelessness. I went to the Joint Office and I said, look, we need someplace for folks to go. We can't send them out in the street. They have no place to go and they're afraid just like everyone else is. And I asked if my community center, Charles Jordan Community Center in North Portland, might be a possibility to open up a shelter. And the Joint Office said initially, no, that's a public space, not sure we can use it, not sure we can access it. And then on a Wednesday, they said, Andy, actually, we do want you to open that shelter. We want it to be 90 beds. We would like it to be a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-week facility. We would like you to run it. And we would like it to be open in 72 hours. Can you do that? And I laughed. And I said, yeah, we can. And so over the next 72 hours, we hired up 20 staff, and we opened the Charles Jordan Community Center for sheltering folks and ended up having a 90-bed shelter that was open for the bulk of the pandemic. Well, as the pandemic went along and I continued to lean into this work of sheltering and supporting individuals experiencing houselessness, and the church was closed and we weren't meeting, it became very, very clear that my work, my calling was moving out of parish ministry and into full-time work as the director of emergency management for Good Multnomah. And I eventually did transition, left the ministry, and began doing the work for that organization. And in my time there, I kept reaching out to as I was on the board, I would reach out to other members of the board and say, this work is important. And the model that we use to do it is a good one. It's effective. This organization is growing, and we keep being asked to do this work for non-veterans. We need to serve folks who aren't veterans in the same way that we serve all of our vets, because this issue keeps growing. We keep seeing more and more folks living on the street. The mission of Do Good was veterans, and so the board continued to push back and say, we love your heart, but that's not the mission. The mission is for veterans. And so myself, the executive director of Do Good, and the deputy director of Do Good said, well, in that case, let's start another nonprofit. And so that's what we did. And we started All Good Northwest. All good because it's for everyone, but also because at the very heart of our mission as All Good Northwest, we believe that every human being is intrinsically good. Every human being is born good. And if we interface with one another, and if we interface with people who have gone through tremendous amounts of trauma in their lives and are currently experiencing the trauma of houselessness, if that's how we choose to engage, then our work is going to look significantly different than other agencies who do this work as well. Oftentimes, individuals experiencing houselessness will go to receive services as an agency, and too often they're either screened out because they have severe and persistent mental illness or severe addiction issues, or they're treated like a number. They're brought in and they become bed number 4, and they're forced to repeat their story over and over in order to get services, which is traumatic every time individuals have to do that. And we said at All Good, we are going to do things differently. We're going to treat people like human beings who are intrinsically good. And we're going to not treat them like a number. And we're going to work on screening people in instead of screening people out of services in our organization. And so we applied to become a 501c3, and that happened last year. And then as soon as the Joint Office of Homeless Services got wind that we'd started this new organization, they gave us a call. They gave me a call and said, Andy, we hear that you have a new organization, and we've got a project that we'd like you to work on. Now, I need to mention that in my time, and it was mentioned in the bio as well, in my time as Director of Emergency Management, I went from running a little overnight shelter to eventually overseeing a number of different varieties of sheltering projects, including the congregate setting, as was mentioned, which is a traditional set the cots up in a large space, provide meals and bathroom and shower and all of that, and folks have a place to be with case management to help work on whatever's next for them. But I also opened a couple of motel shelter spaces where the county procured motel spaces and everyone had their own individual room at that shelter. And finally, I was also a part of the design and building and eventually opening of St. John's Village, which is a 19-unit tiny home village, which is an alternative shelter model up in St. John's in my beloved North Portland. So I've had experience very quickly in my career. I experienced doing a number of different kinds of shelters. And this is why the Joint Office reached out and said, we have this project, and it consists of 3 villages that are currently known as C3PO. And 2 of these villages are culturally specific, and 1 is an all-inclusive village. There's a BIPOC village, a queer affinity village, and an all-inclusive village. And they said currently these villages are essentially camps because they had been opened as an emergency response to the pandemic. The city and the county realized, wait a minute, we need a place for individuals experiencing houselessness to socially distance, if we all remember that term, to socially distance even as they camp. And so they literally found plots of land and put pallets down for folks to put their tents on, brought in portable toilets and brought in meals, and folks just had a place to be. And eventually those camps developed into communities. The tents were replaced by pallet shelters, and folks were in a self-governed, autonomous space that was indefinite because no one knew how long the pandemic would last. Well, eventually, one fiscal sponsor of those villages dropped out due to lack of capacity, and then another fiscal sponsor dropped out because of lack of capacity. And so the Joint Office came to us as a new organization with 0 projects, but lots of experience, and said, would you be willing to transform these villages from being indefinite places where people just stay into alternative shelter spaces with intentionality around case management, housing navigation, behavioral health services, to move people out of sheltering and into permanent housing, or whatever self-efficacy and independence looks like for them. I said, it's a big project. There are 3 villages. It's an expensive project, and we'll give you a 3-year contract to do that. Folks, they asked us to do this in August of last year, August of 2021, the middle of August to be more precise. And they said, can you be ready by October 1st to staff and to run all of these villages? Well, as I mentioned in my story of opening the congregate shelter, one of the things that we have a reputation for is if it has to be done quickly and done well, we have a reputation for being able to do that. And so, of course, we said yes. We spent the next month and a half hiring up 60 staff, directors, and building an organization. And we have spent the last year essentially building the plane while it's been in the air, and it's been an adventure. Along the way, we also took on the task as we were asked to open a congregate sheltering facility down on Southeast Market Street, a facility that will eventually house 120 beds. And so in the last year, All Good Northwest has started with 3 individuals who wanted to start another nonprofit, to where we now have close to 100 employees, and we shelter over 150 people every night, and soon that number will grow to over 200 individuals that we are sheltering. So that's how we came to be. But what I didn't expect, I knew how to do this work from my time at Do Good. What I didn't expect was how this confluence of creative minds is the director team of All Good would come together to do a service provision model that is different and unique and, quite frankly, innovative. One of the things that I made sure I told our contractors, the Joint Office of Homeless Services, one of the things I insisted on, I said, we will do this project. We will take on this Herculean task of overseeing these villages. But a couple of things I'm going to need to insist on. First of all, we will pay all of our staff a living wage and provide full health benefits for everyone who works for the organization. And so no one at All Good Northwest makes less than $50,000 a year, and every full-time staff from day one has fully paid health benefits. And the reason I insisted on this is I know from personal experience how hard this work is. And I want to take care of our people so that our people are equipped and healthy and can take care of our participants in our program. The other thing that I insisted on is I said, we are going to employ behavioral health specialists at every project that we do. Now, you may say, well, that seems kind of obvious, but I'm going to tell you now, that's not the norm for agencies that do this work. Oftentimes, sheltering and support services and housing agencies farm out the work of behavioral health services to other organizations. And I said, no, I want to have that kind of support in-house. I want to make sure that folks are on site at least 5 days a week who have behavioral health training, because the reality is the behavioral health issues and addiction issues among individuals experiencing houselessness continue to get worse and worse. And so that developed into what we call the all good model. And I want to take just a minute to try to explain that. The all good model consists of what we call wraparound support services. And what that means is that every participant in every one of our programs has a behavioral health specialist. They have a housing navigation specialist, someone who knows the system in the city and has relationships with property management and landlords, et cetera, et cetera. They have a case manager, and they have a peer support specialist, someone with lived experience who understands what it means to be living on the streets and to be in shelter. Every one of our participants has a team that wraps around them. And what we find is when individuals don't simply have a case manager, which typically in this work, you'll move into shelter and you'll be assigned a case manager, and that case manager kind of takes care of it all. And they might have a caseload of up to 50 people that they're caring for. And we insisted on keeping our caseloads low and having wraparound services for folks who come into our shelter system, because what we find is participants are more likely to engage and want to receive services, want to be helped, if they have a team of support rather than just one person who might be able to get around to them every so often. And so we've developed this wraparound support service system as part of our schema that we have for service provision for our organization. And it makes us unique. And as I mentioned before, it makes us a little bit innovative. What it also means is that our services, and I own this completely, our services cost more. It's more expensive. When you hire that number of people and when you insist on paying them a living wage because this work is hard and we want people to stay in the work, when you do that, it's going to cost more money. And so our organization has shaken up the system a little bit. Other organizations who have been around for a long time have had to try to figure out, how will we take care of our folks? And we don't want to lose staff to upstarts like All Good or like Do Good. So really had to re-examine, as agencies who do this work in our city, how we do this and how we can do it better, because that's what's necessary. So the last thing that I want to touch on, and I told the folks who invited me, I told David, I won't speak for the entire time because I want to leave a lot of time for any questions that you have. But I want to talk a little bit about housing first and the issues that we have with the housing first model. This is a model that the Joint Office and the city and the county have been committed to. The theory of housing first, if you're not familiar, basically says that the first thing we need to do to help people who are living on the streets, who are unhoused, is to get them housed. Housing is a human right. And so instead of insisting that people deal with their addiction, deal with their severe and persistent mental illness, deal with whatever are their barriers that have kept them from being housed, we remove those barriers and put them under a roof. Either we get them into shelter and we meet them where they're at, or we, even better, we get them immediately into housing, because it's much easier to care for and work with individuals who are safe and behind their own door than it is to try to mitigate all of these issues while they're still living on the street, because their mindset at that time is pure survival. There is not bandwidth to deal with a lot of the issues that they may very well want to deal with, but they're so incredibly overwhelmed with the task of just living on the street. And they're currently experiencing the trauma of that. The housing first model, I completely believe in. I believe in housing first, but here's the problem we have right now. Our city believes in housing first as well. And so a lot of money has been poured in to placing people into housing. The problem is housing first does not mean and should not mean housing only. The housing first model, even the person who developed the theory of housing first has confessed in public settings that it's not done well or correctly most of the time. And the reason is, once people are behind their own door, they're placed in an apartment, folks figure, we did it. They're not houseless anymore. Best of luck. And the support system that they experienced disappears. And what often happens, and if you know anything about the recidivism rate when it comes to individuals experiencing houselessness, it is huge. Too often, individuals end up falling back into behavior patterns or continuing behavior patterns with no support system to help them with those needs. And so they find themselves back out on the street, having been evicted from that apartment. If you can imagine, you're fresh off the street and you are placed into your own place, and you're excited about doing that. And you've even perhaps been blessed with the asset that is a computer or a tablet or some way to access the internet, which everyone needs right now. And you're going to pay your electric bill, which everybody does online now, but you can't remember your password for PGE. And you are a person who experiences mental health issues, and you feel a sense of crisis and trauma, but you don't know who to call, and you don't have anyone to call to remember that password. And so not only do you not pay your electric bill, but perhaps you engage in coping behaviors that lead to you being evicted from that space simply because you didn't have a support network. You didn't have continued support services. And so the vision, because we're trying to avoid that, we don't want to see people back out on the street after we do the work as an agency to house those individuals. And so the vision that we have is to provide those wraparound support services that folks engage with right away off the street in our shelters, and then in transitional spaces like the villages. We want to see those wraparound services continue when people are placed into housing. There are times in permanent supportive housing projects where those support services come with being a resident in that space, but there aren't enough of those opportunities. And the investment in supportive services beyond sheltering and into permanent housing is pretty low, actually. The dollars haven't been placed there. And so what we fear is, without those support services, we're just going to see the vicious cycle of being unhoused and then housed and then back out again continue over and over again. So we are committed to, in the future, pushing to be afforded the opportunity to continue to do the wraparound services for folks as they're in shelter, because that's how we're going. In my mind, in my humble opinion, that's how we begin to end the crisis. It starts with getting people housed. The way you solve houselessness is to house folks, but it can't stop there. We have to continue to support individuals that we're able to place into housing. That takes more time. That takes more money. That takes more investment. It's not a quick and easy solution, but with a complex issue like houselessness, again, I think it's the biggest issue that we're facing in our city. We need to invest the time. We need to invest the resources. We need to make sure that folks have that support system. Now, the dream is eventually, as folks are living in their own space, they're able to make those connections with our assistance. They're able to make connections to neighbors, to community groups, to be involved in the greater humanity like we all get to, those of us who are blessed enough to experience to be housed, and they develop their own support system and are able to eventually say, I'm good, I've got a team, I got a crew, I got friends, I have family, I'm connected, as we all long to be. That's the vision and the dream, but it doesn't start that way. And that's why people need the extra support once we're able to get them into housing. So that's the work that All Good Northwest does. We still are overseeing these 3 villages. In the last year, we've housed a little over 50 people, which is the equivalent of housing an entire village of folks. That's a pretty good clip for getting folks into housing, especially when you have the barriers that a lot of folks typically have to housing. And so we continue to move on this this model that we're committed to, and hope for many years to come after this first initial year. So I think I've spoken plenty at this point. I'm love to open up the floor to questions.
Wow, the work you've done and the just amazing. I'm just going to let it open up to questions, and we have our first question. Todd, come on in.
Well, thank you, Helen, and thank you, Andy, not only for your presentation today, but for your work in the community and understanding the problem in a holistic way, not only for the community, but for your internal staff. I really was moved by your presentation today. I'm in a wheelchair, as you may be able to see. I don't know what people can tell on Zoom. And I've been a disability advocate for much of my life, and some of that involved housing and real estate. And my question, I've had a concept in my mind for a while, and I want to see what you think of this. I think if there's one thing the pandemic taught us is we don't need as much office space as we have right now. And we don't need as much retail space as we have right now. And I'm wondering if there's a movement to convert some of this office space and retail space into housing.
Great question. I love these questions because so often I think folks drive around the city and they see empty spaces and they're like, why can't we put people in there? Why can't we house people in those spaces? I think you're correct. And I will tell you, it's already starting. So at least it's being converted into sheltering at first. Converting into long-term permanent supportive housing is a little more expensive, a little more involved. But I'm impressed with how folks are committed to repurposing spaces, even just for the initial sheltering. So 2 examples, our current congregate shelter on Southeast Market is a converted former wine warehouse. So it's a massive space that we're able to shelter a lot of people safely because they can be distanced in that space. There's an old Rite Aid building up in North Portland that has been converted into a congregate shelter space. I think more and more folks are committed to using those spaces and converting those spaces creatively into sheltering. I think it can be done for long-term housing as well. So I think your concept is great. And I think we're starting to see that kind of movement. The issue that we have still is the owners of those buildings, they still want to see them profitable. And we have a lot of really good hearted landlords and building owners. So some of that work is happening, but we need more of it. So I love the concept.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Andy. We have a question from Friendly House. Come on in. Come on to the mic and ask your question.
Okay. So yeah, my name is Lawrence. I'm from Portland actually, but I live in Australia now. I'm a homeless outreach worker in Australia, Tasmania. And the thing that I've been working on was the last 10 months that I've been doing that job was that what I really notice is, and as you hit on the idea that you put people in houses and then leave them there, and then they can be even worse off sometimes than they are when they're in the tent. What I've been noticing about my clients and people that I'm working with is that I would say when we talk about the people that you see, the people that everybody has the problem with is like, oh, homelessness, big problem there. You can see them everywhere. That's a tip of an iceberg issue, meaning 1/10 of the people that are living it hard are in those tents. Living it hard can also mean in a situation where children are being raised by violent parents, where people are living with people they don't want to live with because they're having really bad problems with whatever's going on there. The people who live in tents have made a decision a lot of times to be there rather than in a situation where it's worse. Everyone out there who's living it hard is living in a situation where they've tried to figure out the least bad place to be. And sometimes that's a tent. And sometimes it's in a house filled with, a 1-bedroom with 11 people in it, and you're sharing a bed with somebody who's in your family who you shouldn't be sharing a bed with, and then, or just the idea of being put into housing where all your neighbors are drug addicts and drug dealers, and you're trying to deal with your addiction, or you're just trying to be safe. And so what it seems to me, and I'm wondering how, if anybody's trying to take a look at this, is that making some foundational changes in how the communities get set up in the first place. And the best place I've seen in Portland so far, and that was when I was living here 7 years ago, was Bridge Meadows, where they're taking seniors and giving them affordable housing, single parents giving them affordable housing, and then supporting foster children and having all that work together in a multi-generational way in a community. That's the closest thing I've seen to what I think needs to be happening. And I'm wondering how, if anything else like that is happening.
Yeah. Great question. Great observation. You're absolutely correct that the work that we end up doing is for the folks that what we would call the visibly houseless. But the issue is so much more complex. The housing crisis has so many more layers. And you're right that there are folks who are making choices to not live in their current circumstances, even if that means being out in a tent, or if it means being in a space that is not ideal. Unfortunately, I think the answer to your question, I love Bridge Meadows, by the way. I'm so glad you brought them up. I sing their praises. It's awesome. The problem that I see in our city, and I say this to county commissioners, I had lunch with Commissioner Ryan a couple of weeks ago, and I will ask, where's the comprehensive plan? If you have a comprehensive issue with multiple layers, who is tackling the comprehensive plan to deal? Because the reality is right now, most of our solutions are Band-Aid solutions. And most of them are deeply embedded in politics, as we know. We have this solution. It looks good. Yay, we did something, vote for me. And I know that sounds flippant, and I don't mean to, because it's a really difficult issue. But so much of it is mired up in that. And when the reality is, we need to take a comprehensive look and develop a comprehensive plan for the housing crisis in our city. And it's not impossible to do. Other cities are doing this kind of work. If you look at the city of Houston, the New York Times did an extensive big old article about how they've managed to reduce houselessness in that city. And it was a comprehensive plan where agencies like ours, nonprofits, were brought together and working together, moving in the same direction. And unfortunately, that's not always the reality in our city. We have agencies who are competing for the limited dollars that there are. And the other issue that we have that makes it so much more difficult is in the city of Houston, there's no issue with urban sprawl. There's lots of land. And so they can continue to develop and move outside of the city and develop big, beautiful spaces with multiple levels of housing and sheltering options. When we all know in our city, we're bound by boundaries of where we can develop. And so that's difficult as well. So again, I love the question. I don't know if I answered the question, but I think addressing the issue with a much more comprehensive plan and a sense of urgency that it just doesn't, we haven't had enough of. So here we are, 10 years since I started doing this work, a decade later, and the problem keeps getting worse and worse. I think that it's going to take some strong leadership and a comprehensive plan to work on all of the levels of housing crisis.
You, Kathy, Moyd has a question. Come on in.
Hi, I assume you're aware of the fact that Oregon just determined that it is going to be allowed to raise rents by 14% next year. Is there some activity to get legislation to quickly take care of that? Or are we going to end up with a huge increase in the burden on you come January 1st?
I wish I could say the answer is we're working against that. But the reality is, it probably, there's a very good chance that it could exacerbate the issue. And I feel for property owners and for property management and landlords. We're in relationship, building owners, we're in relationship with those folks because we're working to get them housed. And they're in crisis too. If they don't have those rents coming in, they can't survive. They can't continue to house folks. And yet that's just that little, so many folks are so close to the edge, and just raising that rent a little bit is either going to price them out of the neighborhood completely, where they have to move, or if they're committed to staying in the neighborhood, they're going to be out on the street. And so that is a reality that we're dealing with. Part of the reason our church, the church that I used to pastor, moved on building 20 units of affordable housing. By the way, we started that work 7 years ago. That building is due to open in a couple of months because of the red tape and the system that's caused issues for faith communities to be able to develop on their land. We've since changed that legislation. So now we have churches we have faith communities, not just churches, who have land. They have that as a resource. And we all know that the church, especially the church in Portland, is not a thriving institution right now. And so folks are saying, well, we have land. Can we develop? Can we help with this housing issue? I think that can help make a dent if we continue to build affordable housing projects. But unfortunately, it's just not happening quickly enough. So I don't do the political work, but I love the people who do, the community organizers who are out there saying, hold on, before we go raising people's rent and increasing the houselessness issue, let's use our power.
Well, I do some of the political work. I do advocacy for the League of Women Voters. I've been doing it on climate change, but I'm sure that if there's some kind of legislation to probably removing that 7% floor would be the most reasonable thing. That makes no sense whatsoever to have a guaranteed increase of 7%, even if you know, I mean, I can see them saying a minimum of 7%.
Yeah.
But not 7% plus inflation. And so I'm assuming that there will be legislation. The bills have to be in by next Friday to be or there's emergency session. I mean, this type of thing, they could even do an emergency session next week. They got the legislature, at least the Senate probably is there to pass, to appoint people. They have to do that in person.
Thank you for your work on that, by the way. Thank you for doing that work.
Yeah, but this definitely something that we've got to do something about.
Agreed.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you so much. A question from Roy at Friendly House. Come on in, Roy.
Hi, I live in Beaverton, and I'm retired, and I like to explore the city, and I often talk to homeless people, and I've had some bad experiences and good. I would like to volunteer. I'm not sure if you have any connections in Beaverton or suggestions of how to go about doing that.
I do have some connections to some services over there. I'm going to be really frank and tell you that there's not a lot, and yet the need is increasing. So often, we see this in Washington County and Clackamas County. The finger is pointed at Multnomah County and Portland because that's where the bulk of the issue is, but it's increasing in those areas as well. Beaverton's seeing an uptick. Hillsborough, down south in Clackamas County is really seeing an increase in the houseless population. So the opportunities are there. Unfortunately, we don't do work in Beaverton, I'm sorry, but I'd love to see you connected, and thank you for your willingness to volunteer. We need more people who want to do this. Commissioner Ryan is fond of saying that if we're going to pull ourselves out of this, he uses the word ditch that our city is in right now, it's going to take more than the politicians and the nonprofits. It's going to take everyone coming together to do this work. So for you to be willing to step in and do that volunteer work, that you're a part of the solution. So thank you.
So I just go online and try to find somebody to talk to.
Yeah, what I would do is, especially Washington County, you go to the Washington County website or whatever county website, and they will point you to the agencies doing this work, and they love our volunteers.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Andy, a question came in on the chat. Could you help us understand the difference between the word homelessness and houselessness? And somehow when saying homelessness, I get the feeling that there's an insulting component. This is my thing on this, that it's insulting. Can you help us with those two terms?
Sure. I didn't hear the term houseless or become prone to using that until the last few years. I'm from Michigan, as was mentioned. In other regions of the country, homeless is homeless. That's how we talk about it.
Right.
However, advocates for individuals experiencing houselessness are really careful, first of all, about labeling folks. So I even have to catch myself saying someone's a houseless person or someone is houseless, because that's a label. This is an individual, a human who is experiencing houselessness. That does not make up their identity, if that makes sense. And the reason why people moved away from talking about being homeless is the idea that just because a person is unhoused, experiencing houselessness, does not mean they don't have a home or a sense of home. Sometimes people who live in tent communities say, this is my home.
Yeah.
If people are living in tiny home villages, sanctioned or unsanctioned, they find a sense of home where they are with their people. Home is not directly equated to a roof over your head, which is why unhoused or individuals experiencing houselessness has become a term that we're much more prone to using, especially here in our city, but it's gaining traction throughout the country.
Okay. Thank you. There's a question from Dave DiNucci down at Friendly House.
Hi, thank you very much. My question has to do with the tiny houses. You mentioned tiny houses a little bit, and I've been seeing some come and go, and kind of so I think there was kind of a community down, you would see it near the river, near Omsey or something. It seemed like a bunch of tiny houses, and then it disappeared. I never did hear exactly what happened to it.
I can tell you.
Okay, and then there's another one opening out near where I live. A church is opening, like a little bunch, like maybe a dozen or fewer little tiny houses. And by the way, the neighborhood's going crazy about it. And it's like, oh no, we can't have this in the neighborhood. And they're fencing it all in, and it's like you wouldn't even know it's there, I think, if they hadn't announced it and stuff. But one thing I'm wondering is about this constant ebb and flow, and the other one is tiny houses as opposed to other approaches. It seems to me that like energy wise and material wise and stuff like that, tiny houses are not that efficient of a way to provide housing for people. But at the same time, I would imagine some people just need that independence or that idea that they're separate from other people and can live privately.
Yeah. So first, I'll tell you about the moved tiny home villages. Those are actually spaces that we oversee. So the two villages that were down on Water Avenue, both relocated. So the BIPOC village that used to be there has been relocated to Weidler. And so it's up by closer to, by the Crown Plaza Hotel up there off of Weidler near Broadway. And then the QA village was relocated to Southwest NATO. And so both of those villages have been relocated. The third village that we were overseeing in Old Town, which is right down across the street from the old Greyhound station, that one was decommissioned when we had to pull services from that site. And the reason that one was decommissioned, quite frankly, is because our ability to provide services in that space it was untenable due to gun violence. There's so much gun violence, people hearing gunshots throughout the day. We had staff who would be first responders to shootings in the neighborhood. And so we simply told the Joint Office, we can't really do the work of housing folks out of this village because it's too dangerous. And so we ended up relocating a lot of folks from that village out to Multnomah Safe Rest Village. We're out in Multnomah Village right now. So to talk about tiny homes and why the tiny home village model, as I mentioned, I've overseen congregate settings, the motel setting, which is really great in a number of ways. Folks have their own space, their own bathroom, which is a miracle in shelter services. And then the tiny home village model. We need all of these models because not one, we don't have a one size fits all solution to this. Sometimes folks are great in a congregate setting and they can have their needs met and they can work with case managers. But the reality is there are some folks who live outside, unhoused, people experiencing houselessness who will not go into a congregate shelter setting. They've experienced trauma, they've been victimized there in some of those settings, and they're like, no way, I'm not, if I'm going in to receive services, it's not going to be in one of those spaces. And so we need to have other spaces to serve folks, to shelter folks, and to work with them. Now, you're right about efficiency. If we're talking about getting a lot of people off the street and working with a lot of people, the mindset that we have is the efficiency comes by way of investing in support services so that folks become housed and we can work with them in their own setting. So while we may not have 120 beds in a tiny home village, we're able to, the word that we often say is churn. We're going to churn folks out of those spaces and continue to support them in housing. And so we end up having this, we cycle through more folks in those settings if we do our jobs well. If we don't have the support service work, then you're right. People are sitting in a tiny home for long periods of time, and it isn't the most efficient way. So it's about having options, and it's about doing our work well enough to make those situations work and to be effective.
Yes, I think it was about 2 years ago, Helen and I went to a meeting. I guess it was a public meeting. Commissioner Ryan was there, and he was explaining his approach to the homeless problem when he was just starting out at being leading that. And he explained that based on his personal experiences of his brother dying on the streets, both homeless and with a bunch of other problems, I think including drugs, that he was going to be focusing at first on the people who had these multiple factors of adversity working against them and try to serve those as the neediest population first. Now it's 2 years later. How is that working out?
Well, we oversee the first of Commissioner Ryan's planned 6 or 7 safe rest village projects. And so we do end up having the most acute issues that show up, and which is why I insist on having behavioral health staff at every one of our projects and peer support in case folks are ready to engage in a recovery journey, and that has to happen on their time. We don't end up we're not a clean and sober space because we're a low barrier shelter setting, and we have to be low barrier shelter setting in order to be able to serve the folks that Commissioner Ryan is speaking of. He is passionate about that because of his own story of personal loss of his brother. And so we are seeing right now, we have in the first Safe Rest Village, there are upwards of 40 individuals, many of whom experience severe and persistent mental illness, addiction issues. And we have a team out there doing the difficult work of supporting those folks and eventually moving them into housing so that there's room for the next group of folks to come in, because there's just a lot. It's really, I mean, you can see the issue. So there's a lot more need. We're doing our little part to meet that need that Commissioner Ryan talks about.
Dave Gray at Friendly House, you have a question.
Like Roy said, I feel like volunteering a little. And one of the things I have done a couple of times already is to pick up trash where it's not happening often enough. So I would like to know if you can suggest where should I go to do that? And is it okay just to do it on my own independently, or should I do it through one of the organizations you have mentioned?
Both are great. And by the way, thank you for your desire to volunteer. I'm going to, in the chat, I included my email address. I would love to connect folks with resources. And I actually have a friend who runs an organization up in North Portland that's expanding that does that work specifically of working to clean up trash and in our city, and particularly with individuals experiencing houselessness, to help them with trash disposal. Because the reality is, when you live on the street, The options you have for throwing trash away or using the bathroom are so limited. Hygiene is limited. So, but there are organizations of Trash for Peace. There's all kinds of different ways that you can connect. I will say, I think picking up trash is fantastic, especially if you have the opportunity to help with cleanup at some of these camps that are out there. I will just, with one disclaimer, we have to be very careful to stay safe when we're cleaning up some of the things that we have to clean up in those camps. There's some toxic and dangerous things that develop there. We have individuals who are actively participating in their addiction, which means sometimes we have needles, and the reality of that's real. So if you engage in that work, that's why I suggest connecting with an organization, because they have the safety measures that are needed so often when we do this work of cleanup.
Dave, is someone? Oh, here we go. Hi.
Hi, I'm Preston Sue. I'm a new member. I really thank you for all the work you're doing on the ground here, Andy. And this may be a little difficult, but how did we get here? We're a pretty affluent society. And in the previous years, these issues didn't seem to happen. Are we losing family connections, or society breaking down, or where are we going from? I know you're right up close, so
yeah,
I don't know if you got this kind of perspective, but if you can, I may be asking. I need more sociologist here, but I got to ask the question still.
Yeah,
thank you.
I appreciate the question. It's actually something I think about all the time. How did we get here, and how do we move in a different direction? It's a huge question with a big, complicated answer. So I'll answer it this way. I am still, I'll use the word naive, Pollyanna-ish, maybe just dumb enough to believe that we can solve the issue of houselessness. But it's going to take some time, because, and I'm going to take the risk of saying this, the root of houselessness is capitalism run amok.
Yes.
Capitalism run amok leads to houselessness, because as long as the rich continue to get richer and the poor continue to get poorer, and the reason that happens is so the rich can get richer. I know I'm not a sociologist. I don't even do much in the way of theology anymore, but it's really apparent to me that that's where the issue starts, is that discrepancy. And then if we add into that the fact that we are becoming more isolated as a society, and it didn't help that we had to spend 2 years inside quarantined away from folks, and now have this genuine fear of the other that leads us to community breakdown like we have. So again, there's a lot more that can be said on that, but that's something that I'm thinking about all the time, and I'm engaging with friends and folks at the state and even at the national level, asking we had representatives from HUD come out and tour the villages, Housing and Urban Development, and having that conversation and saying, it is a national problem that's happening, and yet the uniqueness of how it happens and why it happens in different cities makes it that much more complex. But the root of it is discrepancy in income, socioeconomics. As long as we have capitalism run amok, and I'm please don't hear me saying that I'm a diehard socialist. That's not me. I'm just saying that if capitalism out of control with no check is going to lead to houselessness, is actually necessary for that to thrive. And that's where the breakdown is, as far as I'm concerned.
There's a question from Hank Robb. What kind of credentials do your behavioral health specialists have?
Yeah, another good question. It's a range. They can be qualified mental health providers, QMHP. I'm learning this terminology. Yes. I should say, before we started All Good, I never had experience with behavioral health being a part of the work, like integrated and baked into the work. So I'm learning how to have, our director of social services has been beautiful in educating me on approaches from that perspective versus I'm just shelter world guy typically. So it's really a beautiful confluence that's happening there. We have folks who have MSWs. So it just depends. We don't have an absolute, like you have to have this certification to be a behavioral health specialist, because there's a number of different categories that falls into. Our hope is, and we actually work with folks who want to pursue their MSW or some other clinical degree. We want to help support that, because the more people who are in the work who have that kind of training and certification, the better off we're going to be.
There's another question from Al. Go ahead, Al.
Yes, you were talking a little while ago about capitalism run amok, and it reminds me of I believe I've read that there's plenty of housing in the United States for all the people. Between the number of people who own 2 homes and the number of vacant houses, et cetera, we could house all the people, no problem.
Yeah,
but we don't.
Well, we could feed all the people too.
Right.
No one should be hungry.
But earlier we had this discussion of the rent control, where the government is essentially telling people how much they can charge on rent on their property. They're taking money out of their hand, out of the landlord's hands to help the homeless. Nobody really thinks that that's beyond something that the government might want to do. New York's had rent control for years and years, et cetera. But could you contrast the possibility that some other kind of government mandates or government reallocation might be the way to solve problems? In particular, if there's some kind of really extreme crisis caused maybe by winter weather or by another flood or another Portland fire or an earthquake or something like that, are you worried that the system might be fragile and we might need to do something really strong to actually finally, when it gets to a breaking point, we might have to do something much stronger to maintain the civilization here in Portland?
Yeah. So I love the question. I do want to make sure everyone knows I'm not an economist and I'm not a politician. So just so that's clear, I have my own take and I have ways that I think about it. I think to some degree we have those emergency responses in place. The Safe Rest Village is funded by federal ARPA funds. There's money that's been put out there because of the emergency nature, quote unquote, emergency nature that we are in terms of the housing crisis in the city. One of the problems I think we have, though, if you ask my perspective is we've lost really a grip on what does emergency and urgency actually mean. We've been in the middle of a housing emergency that was declared years ago. And one of the issues that I have is if, I have 2 kids. If one of my boys falls down, breaks his leg, we take him to the emergency room and we don't wait. We don't wait to do so. We need to get something done for the kiddo. The problem is we don't seem to have the sense of urgency until it's, oh, wow, now this individual who's camping is camping in my yard. That's when we reach that breaking point. And we're seeing that more and more, which is why I think we're seeing the people push and say, and push on electeds and say, we got to do something. You have to do something. That's how I think we end up getting the movement that we need. Otherwise, emergency, urgency, what is that? We don't know.
There's one thing I guess I might ask you to comment on. There was this San Francisco earthquake in 1906, which created an immediate huge homelessness problem. Mm-hmm. And people with money who found themselves in this devastating situation wanted to buy automobiles to leave town. Mm-hmm. And the automobile dealers said, oh, no, you can't buy any of our automobiles. We're giving them to the city to use as ambulances. Mm-hmm. And that was not a government action. That was just a social response by the automobile dealers. Now, as compared that to the present era, is it was the response because of the supreme emergency of the earthquake, or was it because things have changed between then and now that you don't need you didn't need government action then, but you probably would need it now?
Yeah, I think the answer is a little bit of both. I also, quite frankly, and I think that because we're such a divided country, we're a divided society. Yes, we live in this liberal bubble that is Portland, that's true. But when I go back home to Michigan and I talk to my family who see the world in a very, very different way than me, that sense of division, it's hard to have conversations at the dinner table with some of my family because of the way I see the world and they do. Until we come to some place where we can start to connect and start to unify around these issues. Back in 1906, there was a sense of identity of being not just human, but being American. And we come together and we solve issues together. And yes, you have your perspective, I have my perspective, but we don't let those perspectives get in the way of getting things done. We now live in a culture and society where my perspective is so strong and it's the only one that's right and yours is stupid. And so I'm never going to sit at the same table and try to figure out the solution to problems. Until we start to do that kind of movement, I think we're in trouble and we'll continue to be in trouble.
Andy, when you talk about this, this issue, I worked for decades at the Oregon Burn Center, and I was my privilege to see survival significantly increase. People died. These big burns, they died. Well, because of advancements, they survived. But what we were doing is just, good luck with it. Good luck out there. Good luck out there. Sending kids back to school, sending people back to, and they would hide in their houses because of the disfigurement and problem. A small group of us started a support group as volunteers, and very similar to what you did, initially at the church, and then slowly and surely, our community, which was significantly smaller, our little Oregon Burn Center community, began to see the benefit of the support group. Survivors were now become part of the milieu. They weren't just, don't let the door hit you on the butt on the way. They were part of our community because of the support group. And we got to know them more as they were honestly the other. Prior to this, why are you even coming to our meetings at the American Burn Association? We're appalled when survivors would show up at their annual meeting. Like, we're the doctors, you're not supposed to come to our meetings. And they did. Yeah. But slowly and surely, now this is over 30 years I'm talking, we saw a change to the point now that the Oregon Burn Center has psychiatrists, they have peer supporters. There's just like you said, there's the whole package that, and this is a small example of over time, the solution came because the community, from the doctor to the CNA at the burn center and the therapists and the former patients and the survivors are now a unit. And we all see the problem and it's not a problem anymore. I mean, we have the support. Is there a way for the Portland community to see beyond the garbage? I mean, that's what people see now. Or what are you doing in my front yard, you other? And we start to see it as, our city needs to be a big change so that businesses can thrive again and that we feel safe. Yeah. Do you see us ever as a community?
Yeah, you touched on something that I think is absolutely crucial, and that's that we need to stop othering. Yeah. The more we other, and othering is what leads to what we call NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard. Right. Yes, we want people to be taken care of, but don't you dare put any kind of resource near my property, because then my property value is going to go down and you're going to decrease the livability in my neighborhood. All of which are reasonable things to put out there. But there's also this lack of curiosity and, quite frankly, lack of compassion when we continue to other. I'll tell you where I see hope, though. When we look to open, when we were going to open the St. John's Village up in North Portland, the community response by a small but really vocal number of folks who are not in support of that action, they basically hijacked the community association and threatened to sue us and all kinds of actions. They did not want that village there. Despite the fact that we said, this project is going to be a benefit it's a resource for your community. And these folks are not those folks. These are your neighbors. They're already your neighbors. They just live in a tent. We just want to be able to provide a resource so they no longer are stuck with that as their only option. These are your neighbors. They will continue to be your neighbors. And what developed in the face of that opposition is a group of folks called St. John's Welcomes the Village. It's a coalition of community members that came together, and they became a powerful force to say, no, we're actually going to welcome the village to this space. These are our neighbors, and we want to receive and support them as our neighbors and treat them with the kindness and love and dignity that we treat folks who live right next door to us in houses. And that group became such a strong voice in that neighborhood that eventually the opposition faded away. And they continue to support that village. The same thing happened at Multnomah Safe Rest Village. There's a coalition of people called Friends of Multnomah SRV that have come together to support the village and to contribute to our organization and to life at the village, because they see those villagers as fellow human beings with intrinsic goodness that they want to be neighborly too. So there is hope to come together and to stop othering. It's just difficult in the face of some of the harsh realities we deal with when it comes to this issue. But I see signs of that kind of light. And there's one who is a former pastor and believes in community and kinship of humanity. That does warm my heart. There's still a lot of NIMBYism, y'all. I deal with it all the time.
We got a final question, I think, is going to come from Kathy. Can you come in for our final question?
Yeah, mine is back to issue of federal funding instead of state this time, and it's the Section 8 that was I thought that was supposed to be the federal program that prevented at least those who are experiencing houseless because they can't afford to live in their house. And I volunteered with Elders in Action, and they had a monthly meeting where disabled and seniors could come in and work through it. And we had one woman who lived on a second floor apartment. She had rickety stairs going down, and she tripped and fell, and it was obvious she should not be continuing to live there. We could not find anything with less than a 2-year waiting period. And I agree that the political situation is such that trying to go get more federal money is probably not an option, but it does seem like that the programs that are supposed to be keeping the problem from occurring aren't doing the job.
Yeah, you've touched on two important issues there. The issue of funding is one, but the issue of inventory, housing inventory, and Section 8 and affordable housing inventory, and the lack thereof in this city. You're right, wait lists for Section 8 housing are just beyond ridiculous for the folks to sit there on that wait list for that long when the issue is so urgent. And yet we have issues with inventory because we have limits on where and how we can develop. And we have, as much as we have some nonprofit housing developers who want to do affordable housing projects, it's where do you do it? And then where does the funding for supportive services come in these permanent supportive housing projects? Because we can lift a building, we can lift a project, but if we lift the project and we don't have support services, Do-Good has had buildings where they put veterans who everyone deserves housing. Housing is a human right, but veterans are placed in these spaces and they don't have the adequate support services, and they experience PTSD, and they literally have ripped the walls, just because they don't have the support services and connection that they need to be able to maintain that housing.
But maybe there's some low-hanging fruit, which is the people who are only in trouble because of financial, and not the other aspects. I mean, for them, getting them into either preferably keeping them in their current housing or finding alternative housing that don't really need the services.
Yeah.
I agree that a lot of the people, especially the ones we see on the street, are probably ones that do need a more comprehensive environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think I agree that there's the low hanging fruit would be super helpful. This is why I advocate for folks, if you've got land, especially faith communities. As a former pastor, I'm saying I'm working with a church in North Portland right now who has 2 plots of land. And I'm like, which one do you want to build 80 units of housing on? Because we need to do affordable housing for people all along the continuum, people who just don't have enough to pay the massive amount of rent, and for folks
Right.
who have the other needs. So we have to increase the inventory.
Are there any obvious areas that the urban growth boundary could be increased without displacing farmers or doing the things that are supposedly that boundary was intended? There must be at least some areas right around the Portland area that you could go to the LCDC and maybe get some boundaries.
Yeah, I will say this. I've waded into economics and waded into politics. I've already waded into waters that I'm not familiar with. Land use, I'm not going to wade into those waters. I hope so. Let me know if there is land. I'll work on developing it.
Well, okay. I just thought you might have, when you're wandering around, you might have say, gee, this would be a good place. Oh dear, it's not.
Oh, I got a number of ideas. I don't know if I can get that land, but I got places. So Great question. Sorry, I don't have a full answer.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you so much. Thank you. This has just been marvelous and given us so much to think about. There is our president, Dave DiNucci, has a small token of appreciation to give to you. Dave, you there? That's okay.
We will provide you a little coffee cup that has our website and our just a little.
Oh, here comes one. Oh no, it's not the HTTP. No.
Yeah, but thank you so much. It's always great for us to listen to somebody who's been out there, who has experience with this stuff and can get us thinking about, what we can do. And a lot of people in this group really are motivated to do things, but we don't always know what we can do. And you've provided some guidelines for that and what we can't do and what the big problems are, et cetera. So just thank you so much.
Absolutely. If I could just have one more moment, sure. My development and communications person would absolutely wring my neck and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention we're a nonprofit and we're a new nonprofit that's still developing. And while we have obviously government dollars, contribution is still incredibly helpful in doing this work. So if you want to support our work we have lists, wish lists of needs for folks who are in our shelter spaces. We still need the classics like underwear and hygiene and socks. You can never have enough socks at homeless shelters. Or if you want to contribute financially, allgoodnw.org. So it's all good. I'm writing it in the chat as well. Go to our website, and there are a number of ways that you can get connected, that you can contribute, that you can donate, and we would appreciate that so that we continue to do the work of serving our participants and caring for their most basic needs as we're moving them toward independence and self-efficacy.
Do you have an Amazon wish list?
Yeah, and that's, you can find links to that. It's also on all of our social, for those of you who are into social media.
I've discovered that's a fun way of donating and knowing that your money is going to go to a good purpose that's needed by the organization. So absolutely, I'll definitely put you on my list of ones that I do that for.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
And folks, if you look in the chat, it's allgoodnorthwest.org. Andy's written it right there. Thank you, Andy. Thank you for adding that. Very much appreciated.